Good Sunday morning, and thank you for your interest. Thank you for being a part of the Geneva class, virtual edition, as we continue our study of the Gospel of John. And we are now in the 18th chapter, and we're coming to the trial of Jesus. And today we'll look at the trial before Annas and Caiaphas. But I also want us to do something a little different. I want us to consider today the provisions in the Jewish law, that is in the Pentateuch and in the various traditions that were incorporated into the Mishnah and Talmuds, how that law was so designed as to be totally humane, to protect the innocent from any possibility of being falsely convicted, and how every provision of that, maybe save one, was completely ignored in the trial of Christ. So again, thank you for being with us, and I do hope and pray that you are blessed by the class, that you will hear the truth, and certainly above everything else, that God will be glorified. And so, the Gospel of John, the trial before Annas and Caiaphas. Looking first at chapter 18, verses 19 to 27. Trying to answer the question, was Jesus tried fairly under the Jewish legal system? The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues, in the temple, where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me and heard what I said. They know what I said." When he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. There's some confusion about who was high priest. Was it Annas or was it Caiaphas? John said Caiaphas was high priest that year, but then under the law, high priests served until death. They were appointed, and that was it. They continued in a lifetime appointment. Then Annas should be the high priest, and he was at one time. However, remember the Romans had come in, had conquered Judea back in 55 BC. They had annexed Judea to Syria, making it part of a province. And in order to show that they indeed were in charge, that the Jews no longer had sovereignty, they will manipulate and control the high priest, which of course is the highest office in Israel. So any high priest who happened to displease them, they would simply remove and install somebody else. And that's the case with Annas. He was the high priest between 6 and 15. They removed him in 15, installed somebody else, removed him, and then installed Caiaphas in 18. That's why from the Roman standpoint, Caiaphas was the high priest. From the Jewish standpoint, they still would consider Annas to be the official high priest. But the trial under Caiaphas, which was the second trial, was the decisive one. We'll see that the trial under Annas was more simply an interrogation into the possibility of finding some fault with Jesus, a preliminary investigation. But Caiaphas and Annas were of one mind regarding Jesus. Both of these men were convinced that Jesus had to go, he had to die. And so he was really condemned already in their sight. Now, there was a trial the next day convened under the Sanhedrin, and we'll see that also. Now, of course, all of the traditions of the Jews should be based on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, and the law provided three cardinal principles that under no circumstances could be neglected. First of all, the trial had to be made public. It had to be publicized. Secondly, entire liberty of defense was allowed to the accused. They really, we would say, bent over backwards to make sure that the accused had every opportunity to defend himself. Thirdly, there was a guarantee against dangers in testimony, particularly against false testimony, false witnesses. Now, out of these three basic provisions, a number of specific laws and codes were developed that would protect the defendant, and we'll look at some of them in a moment. But in regard to witnesses, a false witness, once he's proven to be false, had to undergo the same punishment as the accused. That would discourage a person from giving false testimony. And there had to be a discussion publicly held before the assembly of the people between the accused and the accuser. Public discussion. And witnesses who testified against the defendant had to inflict the first blows. That's where we get the expression where Jesus said, let him who is without sin among you cast the first stone. Now let's look at some of the protections of defendants which developed over the years in the Jewish system. And as we go through that, I would like you to just bear them in mind when we consider what Christ, type of treatment that Christ received. First of all, only the Sanhedrin could hear cases involving a capital crime. Now, of course, the Jews could not execute a person. The Romans took that right away from them, but they could still hear cases involving a capital crime and then present that to the Romans. Now, the Sanhedrin was made up of, at this time, of 71 members, 23 priests. They would represent the religious element of society, 23 scribes representing the legal elements, and 23 elders, which would represent the social or democratic elements, plus 2 presiding officers, which made a total of 71. All of these judges had to be, as they would put it, Hebrew of the Hebrews, that is, full-blooded. They had 2 Hebrew parents. They were not of Gentile blood. And the judges had to be learned in the law. They had to know the law perfectly. And they also had to be linguists, because oftentimes witnesses were brought in to testify who did not speak Hebrew. And so that meant that the judges had to know their languages. And a judge had to be humble and of good repute, and had to recuse himself if he had any personal interest or involvement in the case. Judges were never to accuse. And really, they were not supposed to be indifferent, impartial. We would think of judges normally being impartial, but under the Jewish system, the judges were supposed to take the side of the defendant and seek every means to acquit him or her. In other words, they seem to be acting in the role of defense attorneys. In order to convict, 37 of the 71 judges had to agree to convict. Now, in case a unanimous vote for conviction occurred, that is, every one of these judges voted for conviction, that was thrown out, because it was assumed that that just couldn't happen, that no one would believe the defendant. So that didn't count. Now, an initial guilty vote and the sentence could not take place on the same day. There had to be an intermediate day between the trial and the sentencing. At any point along the way, if a majority of votes were cast for acquittal, the accused would be discharged immediately. During that intermediate day between the trial and sentencing, the judges would devote themselves entirely to the case. They would not eat or drink or do anything that would distract them from considering the case, and particularly looking for evidence that would allow the defendant to be acquitted. Now, on the third day, when sentencing occurred, the judges could not eat or drink. That is the same as on the trial day and in between as well. They could not eat or drink. And then the judges were polled. Every judge who had maintained his opinion would state that. Would go around through these 71 judges, and the judge would say, I hold to the same opinion that I did during the trial, and my opinion is to acquit, or my opinion is to condemn. And then any judge who in this interim of time had changed his opinion from guilty to innocent was allowed to cast his vote for acquittal, and thus add one more to acquittal. But any judge who changed his opinion from innocent to guilty was not allowed to cast his vote, was not allowed to cast a vote to condemn. And under no circumstances could a trial be held at night. It would be illegitimate. And it had to be held between the morning and evening sacrifices, which means, of course, during the day. Now, in case a person was convicted, then he would be sent on what was known as a death march. There would be a procession from the courtroom to the place of execution. However, even after that death march had started, judges would continue to seek new exculpatory evidence for the defendant. And after the death march had left the judgment hall, an officer of the court was placed at the entrance of the hall with a small flag in his hand. A second officer of the court followed the prisoner on horseback, and he was constantly looking back, turning back over his shoulder, looking back toward the entrance to the judgment hall to see if that flag was waving. If any new evidence, exculpatory evidence, was presented, the first officer would then wave his flag to the second, who brought the prisoner back immediately. And if the prisoner himself declared that he had thought of some new exculpatory evidence, they would bring him back before the judges, and they would do that up to 5 times for a new trial. Now, the procession went slowly, preceded by a herald, and that herald would ask the crowd, or ask people along the way, anyone along the way, does anybody have evidence? And if so, bring it forward. Any evidence that would possibly lead to acquittal. In regard to witnesses, the witness testimony had to be complete. It had to pertain to the whole crime, including the mode of execution of that crime, how it was done. All of these witnesses had to agree, and they had to declare that they saw one another as well as the defendant when he committed the crime. They had to see one another at the place of the crime. 2 or more witnesses were necessary to convict, never by one. And witnesses were examined thoroughly with 7 sets of questions. The witnesses themselves had to be the accusers. And here's something interesting. They had to have warned the defendant prior to the act of his committing the crime. They had to have warned him of the law and of the consequences of committing that crime. It was known as antecedent warning. A person could not be convicted on the basis of his own testimony or even his confession. If he were to confess to committing the crime, he could not be convicted on the basis of that. Even if he were a famous prophet, his confession would not be accepted. And the witnesses had to attest to the identity of the party and the month and the day and the hour and the circumstances of the crime. Anyone hearing testimony who wanted to speak on behalf of the defendant or present any evidence favorable to him would be allowed to speak freely during the trial. But this freedom to speak was not allowed to anyone who would favor conviction. When the accused wished to speak, he was given the most profound attention. Now, having read all of these provisions, and I think you can see how they definitely are slanted in the direction of providing an opportunity for the defendant to be excused, be acquitted, protect his rights, and safeguard against anyone who is innocent from ever being convicted. With that in mind, let's go back to the Annas trial, and here's, I call it the transcript. Here's what happened at the trial before Annas. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. When he'd said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now let's examine this trial a little more closely. Annas questioned him, and I think you noticed that in the reading just now. Annas questioned him about his disciples and his doctrine. He didn't question him about anything he did in the way of an illegal deed or act that violated the law. He questioned him about his disciples and his doctrine. That's a very irregular line of questioning. Now, Jesus did not answer him regarding disciples. He did answer him regarding doctrine. But in so doing, he answered the point about his disciples. Because if he could teach, that is, if nothing illegal was found about his teaching, he was not teaching anything improper, and therefore he was acceptable in the sight of the authorities to teach. If that's the case, he could have had disciples. It would be expected to have disciples who would follow his teaching. Nothing wrong with having disciples as long as he was a legitimate teacher. So how did Jesus answer the question about his teaching? Well, he answered it in line with law and reason. He said, all of my teaching was public, in synagogue and in the temple, and nothing was in secret. I taught openly to the world. And by the way, the correct translation of this probably is not in synagogues, plural, but in synagogue, in the same way we would say, I did my preaching and teaching in church. That would not designate a particular congregation. It could be a number of them. And of course, there were many synagogues. So in synagogue and in the temple, only one temple. But the point is, whenever, wherever I taught, it was open, no teaching in secret. Nothing that I said that everybody else out in public would not know about. And secondly, he requested witnesses from among those who heard his teaching. He shouldn't have had to request it. They should have been there, but he requested it and it was not allowed him. Thirdly, when he was struck, and that of course was totally illegal, when he was struck, he requested to know the reason. So all his responses were entirely in line with the law and entirely in line with reason. Now, one thing about this trial that makes it seem so strange is the fact that the Jews were unprepared for it. They did not want to arrest Jesus during the Passover, lest there be a popular uprising. But when Judas came to them with his proposition that he would identify Jesus and gave them the nudge to do it, then they acted, and thus they acted without proper thought and preparation. So at best, Jesus' appearance before Annas was more of a preliminary hearing, thrown together ad hoc at the last minute. Now, Jesus, as we saw, had requested to be tried properly and to have witnesses, which was, of course, not denied him. Now, in regard to witnesses, the Mishnah set forth three kinds of testimony. First of all, there was vain testimony. When it was determined that it was empty, vain, no content, it would simply be disregarded, it would be thrown out. Secondly, it was standing testimony. That's testimony with substance and relevance. Now, it had to be confirmed. It was subject to confirmation. If that standing testimony, which had substance and relevance, was confirmed, it would advance to the status of being adequate testimony, which is the only testimony which was sufficient to convict. In this adequate testimony, all of the witnesses would agree, and there would be no discrepancies, and then it would advance into the trial. Well, the purpose of this trial before Annas, obviously then, this ad hoc preliminary hearing, was to seek to extract some information that Annas could pass on to his son-in-law Caiaphas that would stand up in court, in the Sanhedrin court. Now, the fact that Jesus very politely, and I think very completely, succinctly, answered the questions, Jesus recognized the authority of Annas. He was recognizing the authority of the man who was appointed under the law. The Romans didn't regard him anymore as a high priest. Jesus obviously did. But Annas assumes that Jesus' teaching was heretical. He assumes that Jesus was a troublemaker, a false prophet, and that he was corrupting the people. Now, that is his assumption that he brought to court, which of course no judge should do. He seeks to find something incriminating in what Jesus has to say. Of course, Jesus said nothing incriminating, as we just went through that transcript a moment ago. Annas's question was full of hostile intent, and that hostile intent was picked up, of course, by that servant who struck Jesus. Now, in that reply that Jesus made to Annas, he said, I always taught in synagogue, but there's an ego in that. Ego is for emphasis always. So if we were translating it with, I think, the thrust that Jesus was putting on that statement, it would be, I, for my part, have always taught in synagogue and in the temple and never in secret. I spoke where the Jews gathered openly, and I spoke to the world. One commentator said Palestine was his pulpit from which to preach. And of course, we would understand that that preaching went out by his disciples, by the apostles, after the day of Pentecost, all over the world. So in that way, Jesus continues to speak to the world. He said nothing behind closed doors, nothing in secret that was not in public. And so Jesus asked them, why are you questioning me? Since I taught this way openly, why are you questioning me? What's your intention, Annas? Well, I think he caught Annas off guard. Annas was apparently unable or unwilling to reply. He was dumbfounded. He was silent. And it seems that in that silence, the underling, the huperete, this servant of the high priest, struck him. John says that this servant was a relative to Malchus, the same servant of the high priest whose ear Peter cut off. Now, remember, Jesus is bound, so he has no way to protect himself. He can't put his hands up in front of his face, and the servant then struck him on the face. And very likely, he did so because he knew it would please Annas, and especially when Annas didn't seem to be able to say anything. He was speechless, and he evidently thought he could pick it up and do something for Annas. Now, the blow and the criticism offered by this underling are both blatantly hypocritical. And further, the violence of this blow is indicated by the term derain, which can be translated to flay or to produce a contusion. I've done that, particularly on a door going out into our patio that closes with great force and has sometimes caught my arm, and at least on 2 occasions has pulled the skin back, flayed it, so to speak. So I know what that's like. And that was what the effect was on Jesus' face. Now, this problem with Annas, it's really multiple problems. First of all, it's at night, and no trial can be held at night and be official. And as we've seen, there is no real case against Jesus, only the attempt to find one, which he didn't do. And it's before a single judge. Well, that could never be. Of course, the Sanhedrin had 71. So any degree of legitimacy of this preliminary hearing, I think, is eliminated. The accused was never allowed to testify, and the accused was assaulted by a court official. And then, once Annas had concluded, quite unsuccessfully, I think, the preliminary hearing was over with no results. Annas left Jesus bound and sent him to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, whom the Romans recognized as high priest. Now, this trial before Caiaphas would not be before Caiaphas alone, it would be before the entire Sanhedrin. As high priest, he would be presiding over the Sanhedrin. It would be held in the Hall of Hewn Stones in the temple. John omits this trial. He says nothing about it, just that he went to Caiaphas. The conclusion I think we would reach from this omission is the fact that John would have considered that the synoptics account was adequate and he didn't need to say anything else about it. That's usually the conclusion we reach in something that John omits. However, for our purposes today, to understand this trial, we're going to have to go beyond John and go to the synoptics, in this case, Matthew 27, 59 to 68, and just take a look at the trial before Caiaphas. Now, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, two came forward and said, "This man said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" I don't need to comment on the many violations of law in this trial. The false witnesses, of course, presented vain testimony, and that was not admitted. But there were these two men who came forward and said they heard Jesus say that he would destroy and rebuild the temple in 3 days. And of course, we understand that Jesus was referring to his death and resurrection. Now, that accusation was important, and Caiaphas sensed that it did have substance to it. And in particular, when Jesus mentioned 3 days, and these witnesses quote him on that, 3 days, that stuck in Caiaphas' mind. Now, if Jesus was referring to the Jerusalem temple, he might be guilty of some kind of maybe sorcery or magic or sacrilege against the holy temple, in which case there would have been a punishment, but not death. It was not a capital offense. But Caiaphas understood precisely what Jesus meant. He did not think, he did not believe Jesus was referring to the literal temple. He knew that Jesus was claiming to be God. How do we know that he knew? Remember when he was put to death and put in the tomb? They stationed guards at the tomb in view of the fact that he said 3 days and I will rise again. That shows that Caiaphas understood what he was talking about. However, the testimony was overthrown, and it's unknown as to why. Possibly there were discrepancies among the testimony of the witnesses, or the inability of these witnesses to agree on the exact place where it was spoken or when. But the point is that Caiaphas did not proceed with this line of questioning about tearing down the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. He needed a quick conviction before the word got out to the public. If the people knew that Jesus had been arrested in this way, spirited away at night, and taken off and put through this mockery of a trial, very likely there would have been some type of uprising, some type of public mob action to try to release Jesus, or at least to protest against it. And of course, the Sanhedrin did not want that. Caiaphas did not want that. So it had to be done quickly before people knew what was going on. And so Caiaphas thought through this. He knew that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, but he had to find some legal handle, some legal condemnation in what he said. And he came forth with a very clever strategy, namely the oath of the testimony. Now, Jesus was not required to give incriminating evidence against himself. No accused was allowed to do that, even in this farce of a trial. However, Caiaphas knew he was a very pious Jew, and he knew that he could not refuse to answer the oath of the testimony, because the oath of the testimony was, I adjure you by the living God. And when you put that before a person, even before Jesus Christ, he's going to have to answer that. And he would answer that. And Caiaphas knew that. And Caiaphas shows his cleverness in the fact that he has two charges here. Of course, Jesus indeed had claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus indeed had claimed to be the Son of God. He puts them together. You see, if you asked Jesus if he was the Messiah, and he answered yes, that would be a crime, but not a capital crime. There were many people who claimed to be messiahs. Many of them were simply kooks, and they were ignored. But it's not a crime that would require the death penalty in and of itself. And if he asked only that he was the Son of God, Jesus had already pointed out, and Caiaphas knew this, that in the scriptures, in the Psalms, it is said that he called them gods. And so that couldn't be a capital offense of itself. But if you put the two together, the Messiah, the Son of God, then Jesus would be swearing that he was uniquely the Son of God, who is the Messiah of Israel, and that is blasphemy unless it is true. Dr. Boyce says, in regard to the Jewish trial, the laws governing his case were broken so many times that it is difficult to see how the trial could have been more illegally run or the laws of Israel more thoroughly flouted. Now, we've looked at the particulars of the law and what it says, but there are three principles that Dr. Boyce cites here, three blatant violations of law: the arrest being at night, the arrest achieved through a traitor and an informer, and also without the necessary basis of a specific and formal accusation of wrongdoing that would later be presented to the court. In this case, it's all illegal. Let's look for a moment at Judas' role in this arrest. In the law, Leviticus 19, verse 16, we read, "You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not stand up against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord." Meaning, the witness had to be of good character, meaning he could not bear witness against a close companion or a friend or a relative. Certainly, he could not take a bribe. Also, he could not be an accessory or accomplice. And further, Judas should have made his accusation prior to the arrest. There's nothing about what Judas did that is legal. So we saw the problem with the trial before Annas. What about the trial before Caiaphas? And I'm sure I don't have to go through that. I'm sure you recognize all of the things that were wrong with it, but let's just look at a few of the things. It was at night, and nothing at night has legality. The high priest was not legally allowed to express an opinion or interrogate either witnesses or the accused. It was conducted on the day before a Jewish Sabbath, which was forbidden. It was completed within a 24-hour period. Remember, there has to be that intervening day. It secured a conviction based on the accused's own confession, which was illegal. It concluded with a unanimous and thus void verdict. He secured that by asking the others, what further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard his blasphemy. And there was no defense allowed for the prisoner. Suppose that there was defense allowed. There wasn't, but suppose Caiaphas had said, Jesus, what do you have to say for yourself? Can you support your claim to being the Messiah, the Son of God? He could have asked him to back up his claim with some sign or some testimony. And the judges, those 71 judges, should have inquired diligently into such an important claim as this. Well, there are so many prophecies. Some have said that there are 300 prophecies. Some of those 300 are simply inferences, but there are at least 60 prophecies that are very clear and specific. Let's just take 8 of them. It was Dr. Peter Stoner who wrote a book about this subject, The Stones Crying Out, who pointed out 8 prophecies that were fulfilled. And he said the possibility of coincidental or accidental fulfillment of these 8 prophecies, the 8 together, would be equivalent to taking silver dollars, marking one of them with a mark, and then taking the silver dollars, a huge amount of them, and covering the entire state of Texas to the depth of 2 feet, and then blindfolding a person and telling him that he is to go find that one marked silver dollar, and he can have the whole state of Texas and 2 feet of these silver dollars to find it. Well, of course, that is the mathematical improbability of it. It's like talk about winning the lottery. Look at the mathematical improbabilities of your getting the correct lottery ticket. So let's just take 8 prophecies. He could have said, you know, the scriptures say the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. I was born in Bethlehem. The scriptures say the Messiah would be born of a virgin. My mother, Mary, was a virgin. You can ask her. The scriptures say that the Messiah would be born of the tribe of Judah. I am from the tribe of Judah. I am from the house of David. The Messiah would be preceded by one like Elijah. And there was John the Baptist, and they all knew that. The Messiah would do great miraculous works, and he performed them, and no one denied them. The Messiah would make a public entrance into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Jesus could have said to them, I did this, and you know it. And he could have said, the scriptures say that I would be betrayed by a close friend for 30 pieces of silver, and you know that. You gave 30 pieces of silver to Judas. And further, that the Messiah would be a man of poverty and suffering, despised and rejected by the leaders of Israel. Jesus could say, that's the very thing you are doing right now. Yes, he fulfilled the prophecies. But what defense could he have offered for his claim to be God's son? He could have put it in Isaiah 9:6, which says, he shall be called Mighty God. Or Psalm 2:7, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Or Isaiah 7:14, the virgin shall be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Or he could have mentioned to them that there are many passages in the Old Testament, and he would have said the scriptures, which talk about the angel of his presence, one called the Lord, who is obviously divine, such as the Lord who came to visit Abraham and Hagar, and the one seen in the fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar. Throughout the scriptures, you would find this angel of his presence, and Jesus would say, who is that angel of his presence? I am the angel of his presence. I would add also, he could offer his life and his teaching as consistent with his claims. Who among you can convict me of sin? Now, I've said there's one thing about this farce of a trial that was indeed legal. There was a second trial. It was held in the morning as a formal session to condemn Jesus, but it met the law that required a second session to pass judgment. That's it. Before we conclude our class today, let's look at the case of Peter, because John mentions him. We looked at a part of that situation last week and concluded it today. The scene of the denial. Peter had entered the courtyard with the help of, I think, John, one whom John describes as another disciple, who got him into this courtyard. And there he encountered the maid who said, you're not one of his disciples, are you? And he denied it. That's the first denial. He went out into the covered entryway from the temple, and he encountered 2 maids and a man. That's Then was the second denial and the first crowing of the cock. He returned to the court, apparently, and several men confronted him, leading him to his final denying with curses and the second crowing of the cock. So the net is now drawn around Peter. The cock crowed at about 3 a.m. That's the time, according to Luke, that Peter looked into the face of Jesus and wept bitterly when he realized what he'd said, what he'd done. Now, a case for Peter. Let's look at this. Even though Peter denied Christ, that's shameful. And of course, he had to repent of it and be restored. But we can offer a case for him. Jesus prayed for him, the intercessory prayer of Christ. When according to Luke, Jesus said, Peter, Satan has desired to have you, that he might sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith fail not, and when you are converted, strengthen your brothers. After Peter had insisted that Jesus would not die, he just wouldn't allow that. Secondly, he did follow Jesus. He followed him all the way into the temple. He did love Jesus, which later he will confess. And he did try to defend Jesus. I think cutting off Malchus' ear would be an example of that. And he did confess Jesus, as the account in Matthew has it. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So what went wrong with Peter? What were his problems? Well, he was confident. Though everybody deny you, Lord, I will never do. Jesus told his disciples to pray that they enter not into temptation. He obviously failed to pray. And even though he followed him, he followed at a distance. Dr. Boyce points out, he also found himself standing in the way of sinners. Psalm 1, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scoffers. Luther comments, Peter's case serves as a good illustration of the great fruit of passion and the forgiveness of sin. Of course, forgiven because Jesus prayed for him. Linsky notes that Peter and John, of course, he believes the other disciple was John, that Peter and John, that love drew them to follow, but fear kept them at a distance. And Linsky also suggests this interesting thought. He says, John recounts the incident and puts himself into it as the disciple, the other disciple, perhaps to take full blame. In other words, saying, look, I know Peter did wrong. I know that he denied the Lord, but I'm to blame for it. I'm the one who got him into the temple where all of this happened. If I hadn't done that, he wouldn't have had the occasion to deny Christ. That's possible. And also, what about this maid? She may have been very proud of herself, the first maid who said, you weren't also one of his disciples, were you? Calling attention to that fact, and perhaps to the men who are gathering around saying, this little maid can know something and figure out something and witness something that you didn't. That's possible also. So the trial before Annas, the trial before Caiaphas, there's another trial, and that's the trial before Pilate. And in this case, we have to consider Roman law as well as the Jewish law. And that's our topic for next week. So again, I thank you for your interest for this study of the trial before Annas and Caiaphas. I wish for you a very blessed week, that the Lord will bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you, that the Lord will lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom.